The tall glass and steel building of Frostman Enterprises loomed over the downtown skyline, its sleek design a symbol of corporate power and success. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, filled with the soft hum of computers, ringing phones and the steady clack of high heels on marble floors. At the front desk sat Margaret Maggie Walters, the company's secretary for nearly 30 years. She had seen the company grow from a small startup to the multi-million-dollar corporation it was today. In the early years, she had answered phones, scheduled meetings, and managed office supplies. As the company expanded, so did her role. She handled clients, organized events, and even became the unofficial keeper of the company's secrets, both professional and personal. Maggie had seen it all, and for the most part, she had kept it to herself. But that day, the world around her was about to shift. Maggie sat at her desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she scanned an email. Her fingers, though aged, still moved with the precision and speed that came from decades of typing. She glanced up as the door to the CEO's office swung open and a young, confident woman in a sharp suit strode toward her desk. Claire Frostman, the CEO's daughter. Claire had been a force in the company for a few years now, having taken over from her father, who had stepped down due to health problems. Claire was in her early 40s, and though she had inherited the business acumen of her father, she had inherited none of his humility. The company was thriving under her leadership, but her approach had begun to wear on many employees, particularly those who had been there longer. "Maggie," Claire said, her voice brisk, "I need you in my office. Now." Maggie straightened in her chair, momentarily taken aback by the sharp tone. She had been expecting to continue her usual routine, filing, answering calls, and assisting clients. But something about Claire's expression told her that today was different. She stood slowly, smoothing down her blouse, and followed Claire into her office. Claire's office was a modern, minimalist space, sleek glass desks, expensive art on the walls, and an intimidating view of the city from the windows. Claire sat behind her desk, eyes narrowing as she motioned for Maggie to sit in the chair across from her. "Maggie," Claire began, her voice cool, "I've been looking at the company's operations, and frankly, we need to make some changes." Maggie's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't say anything. She had heard rumours about layoffs and restructuring, but she hadn't expected it to affect her directly. "We've been moving toward a more modern, streamlined approach," Claire continued, "and I think it's time we make a clean break from some of the older systems we've been using. That includes you." Maggie's chest tightened, but she kept her composure. "What do you mean?" "You've been with the company for a long time, Maggie," Claire said, her tone suddenly cold. "But you're just too slow, outdated. It's not personal, but I think we need someone younger, someone more in tune with the current pace of the business." Maggie felt her throat tighten. She had been a loyal employee for almost 30 years. She had never once complained, had never asked for anything other than the chance to do her job well. "I'm sorry," Claire continued, "but we're letting you go. Effective immediately." The words hit Maggie like a punch to the stomach. She had expected this day to come at some point. But not like this. Not with no warning, no consideration of her years of service. She had always prided herself on being a part of the team, on helping the company grow. But in Claire's eyes, she was just an obstacle now. A relic. Maggie stood slowly, her hands shaking slightly. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll gather my things." Claire didn't even look up as Maggie left the office. "You can send your belongings home with HR," she called after her, as if the decision were already final. Maggie walked out of the office, the weight of her dismissal settling heavily on her shoulders. She passed her desk, where she had spent countless hours answering calls, sending emails, and coordinating meetings. She lingered there for a moment, her eyes misting over as she thought of everything she was leaving behind, but there was no time for sentiment. She had been dismissed, and there was nothing she could do to change it. At least, that's what she thought. As she was leaving the building, the receptionist called out to her. "Maggie, wait!" Maggie turned to find Tom, the head of HR, rushing toward her. He had a concerned look on his face. "I heard what happened," Tom said, his voice low. "Listen, I know it's not much, but I want to give you a heads up. Claire's made some decisions that could really come back to haunt her." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I can't go into details," Tom said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "But there's been some shady contracts, underhanded business deals. If someone looks closely at the books, the company could be facing some serious legal trouble." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want me to do?" Tom looked at her carefully. "I'm just saying, if you want to, you could be the one to bring it to light. You've been here long enough to know where the skeletons are buried. If you want to, you could be the one to save the company." Maggie looked at him, stunned. She hadn't expected this. She was no longer an employee. She was a former employee with nothing but her years of experience and loyalty. But as she stood there, thinking of Claire's dismissal and the way she had been treated, something inside her shifted. She had spent her life building this company, and she wasn't going to let it collapse because of someone else's greed. "I'll do it," Maggie said, her voice steady and resolute. Tom nodded. "I'll help you, but be careful. If Claire finds out what you're doing, she'll go after you." Maggie's resolve hardened. "I've spent 30 years here, Tom. I'm not letting her tear it down." With that, Maggie began her quiet mission to save the company she had helped build. And as the days passed, she uncovered one damning document after another. Shady contracts, financial mismanagement, and questionable dealings that threatened to bring Frostman Enterprises to its knees. When the evidence was finally undeniable, Maggie went straight to the board of directors and presented everything she had discovered. The fallout was swift and severe. Claire was forced out of her position as CEO, and a full investigation was launched into the company's financials. Maggie had been fired, but she had just saved the company. As she stood at the front of the room during the emergency board meeting, Claire's face flushed with anger and humiliation. Maggie's quiet determination was the only thing standing between Frostman Enterprises and disaster. Maggie didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the one she'd eaten breakfast at for decades before heading into the office, now cluttered with old notebooks, labelled folders, and a laptop that whirred a little louder than it should. Outside her window, the city lights flickered on and off, indifferent to the storm brewing quietly in her mind. Being fired had hurt more than she expected, not because of the job itself, but because of how easily she had been dismissed. 30 years reduced to a single sentence. "We need someone younger." Still, hurt wasn't what kept her awake. Memory did. Maggie had always been careful. She kept records because someone had to. Calendars from years ago, email chains that never quite sat right, meeting notes where decisions were rushed through and objections were quietly ignored. At the time, she'd told herself it wasn't her place to question executives. Her role was to organize, to support, to remember. And she had remembered everything. The next morning, Maggie returned to Frostman Enterprises, not as an employee, but as someone who knew the building better than most of the people still working there. She signed in as a visitor, nodding politely to the security guard who looked surprised to see her. "I left something at my desk," she said calmly. He hesitated, then waved her through. "Go ahead, Maggie." Her desk was already half cleared. A cardboard box sat beside it, labelled with her name. Someone had unplugged her phone. Her computer was gone, but the filing cabinet wasn't. Maggie unlocked it with a key she'd carried for years. Inside were the documents no one else ever bothered to check. Archived contracts, handwritten notes, old vendor agreements. She pulled out a slim folder marked Northbridge Consulting. Her stomach tightened. Northbridge had been a minor contractor once. Under Claire's leadership, it had suddenly become a strategic partner, receiving large payments for vague services. Maggie remembered the meeting clearly. Claire pushing it through while legal asked for more time. That time was never given. Maggie took photos of the documents with her phone, then slipped the folder back where it belonged. Before leaving, she noticed something else. A sticky note tucked inside her old desk drawer. Her handwriting, check amendment dates. She frowned. Even she had forgotten that. At home again, Maggie compared the contracts. Original agreements. Amendments filed months later. Signatures that didn't match timelines. Clauses that shifted liability quietly, dangerously. By the afternoon, her hands were trembling. This wasn't just bad management. It was exposure. She called Tom. "You were right," Maggie said quietly. "This isn't a risk. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Tom exhaled sharply. "How bad?" "If Northbridge is sued," Maggie replied, "they'll drag Frostman Enterprises into it. And the way these contracts are written, we won't be protected." Silence. "What do you want to do?" Tom asked. Maggie looked at the files spread across her table. "I want to stop it before it happens." That evening, Maggie requested a meeting with the board, not as a whistleblower, but as a witness. She didn't accuse. She presented timelines, paper trails, facts. The room grew quiet as she spoke. One board member leaned back, frowning. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" Maggie met his eyes. "Because the people who noticed were told to move faster, or move aside." Another board member asked, "Why are you doing this now?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "Because I was fired yesterday, and because this company still matters to me." By the time the meeting ended, legal counsel had been called. Auditors were scheduled, and a decision was made to halt all dealings with Northbridge immediately. Outside the boardroom, Maggie stood alone in the hallway she'd walked for years. She was no longer invisible, and she wasn't finished, because the lawsuit hadn't been filed yet, and she intended to make sure it never would. The tension inside Frostman Enterprises grew by the hour. By the third day after Maggie's meeting with the board, emails were being forwarded, meetings were being cancelled, and the legal department had locked itself behind closed doors. Auditors walked the halls with tablets in hand, asking quiet questions no one wanted to answer out loud. The company was still operating, but barely. It felt like a building holding its breath before an earthquake. Claire Frostman noticed immediately. She stood in her office, staring through the glass walls at employees who suddenly avoided eye contact. Her confidence hadn't vanished, but it had cracked. She could feel it. The shift in energy, the way power was no longer flowing effortlessly in her direction. "Who started this?" she snapped at her assistant. The assistant hesitated. "The board initiated an internal review." "Why?" Claire demanded. "Over what?" There was another pause. "Contracts." "Specifically, Northbridge Consulting." Claire's jaw tightened. That afternoon, Claire called an emergency executive meeting. She spoke quickly, forcefully, dismissing concerns as overreactions, blaming legacy paperwork, and inefficient oversight. She framed it as a clean-up, nothing more. But the lawyers in the room weren't nodding. One of them finally said, "These documents weren't just overlooked, they were amended retroactively. That exposes us to serious liability." Claire slammed her hand on the table. "That's ridiculous. I approved those changes." The room went silent. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "That's exactly the problem." Meanwhile, Maggie sat at her kitchen table again, this time with more company than before. Two attorneys hired by the board had come to speak with her. They listened closely as she walked them through years of context, not just contracts, but patterns. Who pushed decisions, who bypassed safeguards, who rushed approvals at the last minute. They asked her why she hadn't spoken up earlier. Maggie answered honestly. "I did, in the only ways I could. Notes, questions, requests for clarification. They just never went anywhere." One of the attorneys nodded. "Because no one thought the secretary would remember." Maggie didn't smile. That evening, Tom called her again. "Claire knows," he said quietly. She's asking questions. About you. Maggie exhaled slowly. I expected that. She's furious, Tom added. She thinks you're doing this out of spite. Maggie looked at the stack of documents beside her. This isn't spite. This is prevention. The next morning, Maggie received a formal request from the board. They wanted her present during negotiations with Northbridge's legal team. The contractor had been alerted that Frostman Enterprises was suspending payments, and they were threatening to sue. Maggie dressed carefully that day, not to impress, but to remind herself who she was. She walked into the conference room with steady steps, carrying nothing but a thin binder. Northbridge's attorneys sat across the table, confident at first. They argued breach of contract, damages, bad faith. Then Maggie opened her binder. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't accuse. She pointed to dates, to clauses, to signatures added weeks after the fact. She showed how Northbridge had been paid for services never delivered, and how the amendments Claire had approved shifted the risk illegally. The attorney's tone changed. By the end of the meeting, Northbridge requested a recess. By the end of the day, they withdrew their threat of litigation. Word spread quickly. The lawsuit had been stopped. Not by a CEO, not by a flashy legal strategy, but by an elderly secretary who had never stopped paying attention. Late that night, Maggie walked past Frostman Enterprises one more time, lights still on in the upper floors. For the first time since being fired, she allowed herself a small smile. Claire had removed her because she thought Maggie was outdated, but in the end, it was Maggie's memory, her patience, her refusal to forget, that had saved the company. And tomorrow, the board would decide what to do with a CEO who had underestimated the quietest person in the room. The board meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. By 7:30, the executive floor was already tense. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Phones buzzed non-stop. Assistants moved quickly, eyes down, as if speed alone could protect them from what was coming. Claire arrived early. She sat alone in her office, staring at the city below, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time since becoming CEO, she felt something dangerously close to uncertainty. Every report on her desk told the same story. The lawsuit had been avoided, but only because the board had intervened, and the board had intervened because of Maggie, the secretary she had fired without hesitation. At 8 sharp, the boardroom doors closed. Claire sat at the head of the table, posture straight, expression controlled. Around her were the directors, legal counsel, and auditors. One chair at the far end was empty. Then Maggie entered. She wore a simple grey suit, modest but neat. She didn't look triumphant. She looked calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're standing on facts, not opinions. A board member nodded to her. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Walters." "Of course," Maggie replied. The meeting began without ceremony. The lead attorney summarized the situation, the near lawsuit, the contractual exposure, the emergency negotiations. He was precise, clinical, and unmistakably clear. If Ms. Walters had not intervened, he concluded, Frostman Enterprises would currently be facing litigation with damages in the tens of millions. Silence followed. Claire shifted in her chair. "With all due respect," she said tightly, "this is being exaggerated. These were strategic decisions made under pressure." One of the board members turned to her. "Strategic decisions don't override compliance." Another added, "And compliance warnings were raised, repeatedly." Claire's eyes flicked briefly to Maggie. Maggie spoke then, not defensively, not emotionally. "I never assumed bad intent," she said, "only risk. My job was always to protect the company from what we didn't want to see." A board member leaned forward. "Miss Walters, were you ever instructed to ignore these concerns?" Maggie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly, "I was instructed to move faster." The room went still. The implication was clear. After a long pause, the chairman spoke. "Claire, given the findings, we are placing you on administrative leave effective immediately. An independent review will determine next steps." Claire's composure finally cracked. "You're choosing her over me?" she said, disbelief sharp in her voice. The chairman corrected her gently. "We're choosing the company." Claire stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. She looked at Maggie, really looked at her, not as an outdated employee, but as the person who had undone her with nothing but memory and patience. "This isn't over," Claire said quietly. Maggie met her gaze without flinching. "For the company," she replied. "It is." Claire walked out. No applause followed, no satisfaction, just relief. When the room finally emptied, the chairman turned back to Maggie. "We owe you an apology," he said. "And a debt." Maggie shook her head gently. "I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because I cared." He nodded. "All the same, we would like you to return as a senior compliance advisor with full authority." Maggie considered the offer. 30 years ago she had taken the job to pay bills. Now she would take it to make sure no one else was ever dismissed as irrelevant again. "I'll return," she said, "on one condition." The chairman smiled. "Name it." "That the quiet people are listened to," Maggie replied, "before there's a crisis." He extended his hand. "Agreed." As Maggie left the boardroom, sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the hallway she knew so well. She walked past her old desk, soon to be hers again, but different now. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't sought revenge, she had simply remembered. And in doing so, she had protected a company that once thought it no longer needed her from the costliest mistake of all, forgetting the value of experience. The company didn't feel the same when Maggie returned, and that was the point. Her desk was no longer at the front reception. It sat just off the executive floor now, glass walls replaced by solid ones, a quiet signal that her role had changed, but Maggie herself hadn't. She arrived early, left on time, and carried the same notebooks she always had. Only now, people waited when she spoke. Claire's absence was noticeable. Meetings were calmer, decisions slower, questions were asked instead of brushed aside. For the first time in years, the company felt like it was thinking before acting. Maggie made it a habit to visit departments she had rarely been invited into before: legal, finance, operations. She listened more than she talked, but when she did speak, people leaned in. She had no interest in authority for its own sake. What she wanted was prevention, the quiet kind that never made headlines. One afternoon, a junior analyst knocked on her door, nervous. I found something," he said, holding a folder. "I wasn't sure who to bring it to." Maggie smiled gently. "You did the right thing." Together, they reviewed the issue, minor but risky if ignored. Maggie guided him through how to document it properly, how to raise concerns without fear. As he left, visibly relieved, Maggie felt a warmth she hadn't expected. This was why she had come back. Months later, Frostman Enterprises released its annual report. Buried in the middle was a single line most people would overlook. No pending litigation. Investors were pleased. The board was satisfied. The company's stock stabilized. But Maggie measured success differently. She saw it in the way assistants spoke up in meetings, in how executives paused before signing anything rushed, in the quiet understanding that experience wasn't an obstacle, it was insurance. On her 30th anniversary with the company, the board held a small gathering. Nothing extravagant, just coffee, cake, and sincere words. The chairman raised his cup. "To Maggie Walters," he said, "who reminded us that wisdom doesn't expire." Applause filled the room. Maggie felt her cheeks warm, embarrassed but grateful. When it ended, she returned to her desk, just another workday waiting to be done. As she shut down her computer that evening, she passed the empty CEO office. The lights were off, The glass walls reflected only the city beyond. She didn't feel triumph. She felt peace. Because the secretary who had been fired wasn't saved by the company. The company had been saved by her. And this time it remembered.